Hi everybody, it's Grace here, and this is part one of the 3-video lesson entitled Guide to Crossfire Lecture. So let's distinguish between the 3 different crosses before we dive into anything. So first of all, we have first cross, which happens between the 2 first speakers. This happens right after constructive and prior to rebuttals. Next, we have second cross. This happens between the 2 second speakers. This happens after rebuttal and right before summary. And then third and finally, we have grand cross, which occurs between all the debaters in the round. This happens right after summary and right before final focuses, which are the last speech in the round. So in this video, I'm going to be specifically going over first cross. Now, first cross is really important because it's your first impression on the judge. Although you already read your constructives, those are pre-written speeches. But first cross is the first time that the judge gets to see you do things on the spot and gets to really test and subconsciously view your knowledge and your perception in the round. With that, there's some important things to remember going into it. The purpose is to understand and break down arguments. So if you are confused on an argument that your opponent read, for example, you want to ask those clarifying questions because it's much better to get an established understanding of arguments early in the round prior to rebuttal than trying to figure those things out way later in the round. Next, and really importantly, you really want to establish your narrative and limit their narrative. So what does this mean? At the end of every debate round, things can get really messy, but more often than not, the judge is going to vote for what they hear the most, the big picture, a concept that is the most familiar to them, and that's your narrative. So with every question, you want to take that opportunity to further drill into the judge's head what the big picture idea that you're trying to paint is. And if they're trying to do the same thing, what you want to do is ask them questions, disconnect their links, and strategically crowd them out of their own narrative. So for example, if they're going on a tangent about their case and you hear something that sounds off, you can say, wait a minute, and then you can ask a question about that to not allow them to establish that narrative in the judge's head. Next, you want to set up the strategy for the rest of the round. Again, this is kind of your first impression. So whatever your strategy is in that round, you want to establish that early on. So for example, if you would rather have your opponent go for their second contention, maybe you will really drill them on their first contention so that they feel almost scared to go for that, and then they go for the second contention instead. And finally, you want to establish perceptual dominance. I'm going to go over this more in depth later in this video, but essentially first cross is your chance to show the judge that you're in control. You're the most knowledgeable on the topic and they should vote for you. All right, so when it comes to understanding and breaking down arguments more specifically, basically, you want to understand arguments and make sure that everyone understands your arguments as well. Maybe if you're writing a little bit more of a complicated case, if your opponent asks about it, you want to break it down really easily. And you want to make sure to make eye contact with the judge and ensure that everyone in the room understands the arguments that you're wanting to go for. You also want to poke holes in your opponent's arguments. So as they're explaining or as you're coming up with questions, you want to ask about the probability of, for example, them reaching their impact. A lot of times public forum debaters will read these huge magnitude impacts that are never actually going to happen. And you really want to press them on the probability of why that's going to happen. You're also going to want to clarify any framework that might have been brought up in constructive speeches before getting into rebuttals so that you have that established foundation early on. Now let's talk about the narratives more specifically, establishing and closing them out. Again, repetition is key. You want to drill into the judge's mind what you're trying to tell them. You want them to hear it so many times that they could repeat it to you backwards. So make sure that that's in the judge's head and that is the clearest thing they know at the end of the round. Again, don't let them establish a narrative. Ask them questions to be able to sort of change their line of narrative or crowd them out of their own narrative. Force them to go for something else or destroy their narrative altogether. You can do this through questioning the probability, magnitude, or time frame of their impact. For example, if they have an impact and maybe it's true, but it's not going to happen for hundreds of years, you really want to press them on why that's such an imminent issue as compared to yours, which is going to happen much sooner. Next, you always want to think about what your strategy is going to be. So you want to set up your partner and you for success in the rest of the round. So think about the big round vision of the round. What's your strategy? Are you going to try to collapse on your first contention? Are you going to try to have them concede to a non-unique? You want to be thinking about those things early. Always stay one step ahead of your opponent. Next, you want to trace their link chain and disconnect any links and impacts. So with every argument, they're going to have their warrants, their claims, their links, but somewhere you're going to want to find the best place for you to point out their flaw. Maybe it's a piece of evidence that's super weak and you just want to drill them on that. That's going to help to highlight their weaknesses and really show the judge that the probability of their impact is happening is super low. Again, you want to call out bad evidence and preface it by emphasizing your preferable evidence. So for example, you could say, sure, you have evidence saying that relations are good right now, but your evidence is from 2000, whereas ours is from 2020 saying that relations are bad. You prefer this evidence because it's more relatable to the status quo as opposed to how relations were many years ago. Next, you always want to consider the context. So who is the judge? Who are your opponents? And what are the arguments? So if it's a lay judge, you obviously aren't going to want to ask super jargony questions. Instead, you're going to want to ask more big picture, holistic, comprehensible questions and speak more slowly. If it's a more sensitive argument, you want to be a lot more sensitive around those different topics. For example, when it comes to human rights or issues of social justice, etc., you want to be a little bit more sensitive to those. Okay, next is establishing perceptual dominance. So you can do this through adhering to the judge and doing things such as using your flow, because this is really going to show that you're not just making things up off the top of your head. You're really looking at the contents of the round and basically basing your information off of that. You're also going to want to, if in person, go to the center of the room. Even if your opponent doesn't, this is going to show the judge that you are in control and you're confident and you are essentially leading that round. What's really, really important is knowing your arguments and evidence. I cannot stress this enough. If you cite specific author names and dates and what they say, that's going to add to your credibility so much because it's going to show the judge that you're getting everything you say from scholarly sources. So something that my partner and I would do in high school is we would make flashcards with the author's name on the front and what the card says on the back, and we would just memorize those cards that in the round we could have that off the top of our head. Like Wilson 19 says that Russia wants to invade the Baltics in 2021, for example. And this really just adds to your credibility and perceptual dominance that the judge knows. Again, don't do any personal attacks. Always attack the argument in of itself. If you start to attack the way someone speaks or like them individually as a person, you might think that that might make you look more perceptually dominant, but it actually just makes you look pretty insecure and not confident in your own arguments. Be civil, be peaceful. You're going to look a lot better as a result. And of course, it's the right thing to do. Once again, always have a question. You never want to be in a situation where it's your turn to ask a question and you don't have one. That's just a really bad look. So whether that means highlighting things as you go along in the speeches, circling, jotting down notes, thinking ahead, always make sure that you're prepared with these questions. And if you're intently listening, these questions should really just, you should almost have too many questions. So in conclusion, the goal of First Cross is to set up for success in the rest of the round. Think about your big round vision, your strategy. Make sure that you establish early on that you are the one in control and you'll be successful in the rest of the round. Thank you for watching. I hope that this was very helpful, and you can tune into part 2 and part 3 where I go over the other crossfires that happen.